I think is it 6:15? Think so. Okay, thank you. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. So today we're going to talk about the Viking influence on the British Isles, and it's quite extensive, to say the least. I thought maybe 2 seconds on my background for those of you who haven't been in these lectures before. I started as a college professor in history. That later I became a Wall Street lawyer, then a corporate lawyer, finally trade association executive, including tremendous amount of international work. We're now in retirement, so I'm doing lectures on cruise ships. And as a result, we're traveling the world. I've already done 125 countries, so I get a little tired, you know. Anyway, next slide. Anyhow, okay. The Viking word comes from a term that was originally used for a pirate who came from a cove or a fjord. And fjord is a Vik, V-I-K, in most of the Scandinavian languages, and that's how we get the word Viking. And they're known by other names. They're known as Northmen by the Franks. They're known as Danes by the Anglo-Saxons. And they're known as Russ or Rus by the Eastern Finns and the rest. And if you know Russia, you'll know where the name came from. It came from the Vikings, R-U-S, Russia. Because the ruler of Russia in the beginning was Rurik, who was a Viking. And his capital was at Kiev, actually. But we won't go into that, the politics of that for that time. Anyway, Vikings seem to have done and been everywhere. Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, the Byzantine, and even into the Middle East. And when the Vikings found reasons to be in certain places, they were. Let me give you an example. When they found wealth and weak political structure, they raided, and that's what most of us know them for. When they found trade routes, they traded. When they found strong leaders seeking soldiers, they served. And when they found empty land, they actually farmed. And it's something that most of us don't really know too much about with the Vikings, because the stories about the Vikings usually come from the people that were attacked, including mainly the monks. And so there's pretty negative stories, to say the least. They were very resourceful, the Vikings, great voyages, and they were also great traders. And they needed to trade because the Scandinavian countries did not have much metal, and they needed bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin together. I spoke about that with one of the prior lectures. And that copper and tin would form great weapons. And, what's a Viking without an axe or a sword, etc.? Scandinavian is the home of the Vikings, and it was cut off from Central Europe by the sea and very dense forests. They had very dense forests up there. And so it was never part of the Roman Empire, the initial empire that unified a good portion of Europe. Being cut off is one reason they focused on travel by water. Water became the fastest means of travel. And there were markets for foreign products that way, and Vikings did have some things to trade. They had animal skins, they had ivory, and the Roman Empire demanded a lot of goods, and their trade aspects were very strong. The Danes were able to sell food and labor to the Roman army on the Rhine River, and archaeology in the Northlands in Scandinavia has uncovered rich grave goods from Rome, including Roman glass and weapons in their graves. So we know they had phenomenal trade with the Romans. So they were initially pastoral people with sheep, cattle, horses, and goats. They did plant grain for fodder, and they had bread, and they gathered eggs. Fishing, whaling, and hunting made up the mix for their food. But in their northern homelands, there turned out to be a population explosion. And as a result, with the scarcity of farmland, they looked elsewhere. And of course, only the eldest son would inherit the farm. So the younger sons really needed to go out and do something. They migrated and searched for new land so they could farm themselves. Now, to enable sea and open water navigation, it's different, isn't it? So it's different from the thing. Okay. The Vikings were initially pastoral people with sheep, cattle, goats, etc. But, they did a lot of traveling. And to enable great sea and open water navigation, they created these ships. And these ships, they created a keel to help level the ship, so it could carry a mast. And they rode the waves. They didn't battle them. Now, the low draft boats that you see here are what they invented, so to speak. And these could be beached on sandy shores and also go up rivers. And so they were able to go inland when they were invading on the coasts. Their warships could gain a speed of about 12 knots. And they could carry a crew of about 50 in the 9th century. And later in the 10th and 11th centuries, there was over 100 to 200 soldiers, passengers, whatever, on these ships. Now, we've got to make sure that they're in the same... Okay. The word keel comes from the old Norse word, köl, and they have clinker-built ships with planks overlapping one another, so that kept the water out, and they were stitched together. Initially, they were rowing, then they went to sails, and they had a modified paddle, which they put on the right side of the ship, called a steerboard. And that word, styra, is the word in Scandinavian. It's for steer, and the English we've adopted the word steer. Also, though, for us, even on this ship, starboard is a corruption of the Viking steerboard. That is the word that we use for the right side of the ship. And so if you're not familiar with right and left on a ship, starboard's right, and then port is left. And it's easy to remember port because port has 4 letters and left has 4 letters, and that's how you know port means left. Very simple. And in the early days, I used to always had to remember that when I was trying to decide where we were going. Anyway, it didn't go, did it? Does that go? That's. We're having some issues. There's some technological issues here. Yeah, I know. Let's. Okay, this is another kind of ship. This is the Canar. This is an ongoing, cargo ship, able to carry about 50 tons. They could move products more efficiently than they could do over land. It was easy to carry these ships from one lake or river to another over the land, actually. And they raided all kinds of places with these ships. And with this ship, they were able to get slaves, put it on the ship, and sell them elsewhere. That's how they made a lot of their money, was selling slaves. Let's see. Next. You still have it? Okay, good. I think we're out of order, Lynn. I think, okay. There. Wait a minute. I'm there. Thank you. We've had some technical difficulties with the stuff, so we're okay. Let's focus on the Viking expansion in the British Isles and further north. Some other regions had sufficient resources to block Viking excursions, but England did not at the time. And the Vikings had to travel very far to find what they needed. And a hero in Viking lore was the guy who traveled far and returned laden with riches. And it became, that not only did they search for copper and tin, but eventually they were searching for iron. And the Iron Age is one that gave rise to the Viking Age. Now let's see. Do we go to the next, Lynn? Next, Lynn? Okay, good. Hopefully we're back on. This map shows where the Danish Vikings and the Norwegian Vikings raided in the British Isles. The yellow lines are the Danish, the pink lines are the Norwegians, and they're mostly in the northern states, northern areas of the British Isles. They scheduled their raids, actually, also. So they first planted their crops, then they raided, and they returned in time to harvest their crops. Now, which is really very shrewd. The warring kingdoms in England, and we had a lot of warring kingdoms in the British Isles, gave them the advantage because these warring kingdoms meant that England, the British Isles, were easy prey for the Vikings. They weren't able to get united together to block the Vikings, and the Vikings were able to take over. Next. Let's see if it's still working. Good, good. Okay. The Viking raids and settlements occurred between 550 and 1100. And the red areas now, as you can see, are the Norths, the Norwegian incursions, and the yellow are the Danish. And you can see they really took over most all of England, very good, and they took parts of northern Scotland and the islands, where we been today, and they also were able to take over the eastern part of Ireland. Now, next. The first documented raid in the British Isles was by the Danish Vikings at an abbey, Lindisfarne Abbey, in England, and that was in 793. They were able to steal the silver, the books, they enslaved the monks, and sold them to others, and any monks that resisted them, they killed, unfortunately. Now, the chronicle describing all of this was written by a monk, and so you can understand why it's such a negative picture of them, although they deserve it for killing people. And he basically said, even in the chronicle, he said, "Never before has such atrocity been seen." And this was the reaction of so many people, and it's created the perception of the Vikings that we've had that lasted for 12 centuries and we still have today in some ways. Let's see. Next. This is what's left of the monastery at Lindisfarne. Not very much. And we have, next slide, the myths about the Vikings. Nordic warriors with horned helmets, wielding axes, etc. Now, the perception of this is based on the hostile reports of the victims of Viking raids. In fact, they never wore horns. Can you imagine why? If you're in a battle, your opponent could grab the horn, and that would put you at a great disadvantage if he pulled you in or kicked you over, etc. So they were the greatest adventurers the world had yet seen, and the sheer technical skill of their journeys was a new achievement. But, some of these myths that we are still living with were not really true. Because the Middle Ages was pretty a violent time anyway. They were violent, and they killed people, but, Middle Ages weren't, well, I must say, even today, we're in the midst of 2 major wars going on right now, and I wouldn't doubt that we're going to have more, unfortunately. So as you can see from this map, Lindisfarne, which is up in the top there, is very close to Edinburgh, which we talked about yesterday in my presentation on the Industrial Revolution. And so the Kingdom of Northumbria, which is that, experienced only a few years of real stability after this attack, to say the least. Next, the map shows Good. The map shows the Viking expansion from the 8th century. And why did they expand? Well, we already said, we talked about the land, looking for land, and that the youngest son was, looking for his inheritance elsewhere because he couldn't get it at home. They were looking for more profitable trade routes as the old ones decreased in value. And here's something else that the men in the audience might understand. They were looking for women. They needed extra wives and concubines because polygamy was the rule of the day. That was the normal state of affairs. The overpopulation, of course, forced some of them to go out. And it was much more profitable to seek land and ag productivity elsewhere than to clear large forests in Scandinavia. And they first attacked the centers of wealth, which turned out to be usually the monasteries, because the monasteries were easy targets. They weren't fighters, and they didn't resist, to say the least. Next. Moving on to the next. Good. Moving on to significant areas in the British Isles, we'll talk briefly about Ireland. Ireland had not been conquered by the Romans, and so there was no cities, roads, political or administration institutions to block Viking incursions. And so we have extensive Viking raids in Ireland by small mobile groups of Vikings until about 830, when large ships, fleets of Vikings finally raided. And from 1840, the Vikings established permanent bases on the coast. The navigable waterways allowed the Vikings to penetrate deeper into the countryside. And if we go to the next, they were able to found the cities of Waterford, Cork, Dublin, and Limerick. Those are all founded by Vikings. They settled down. They intermixed with the Irish, and a lot of today, even literature, crafts, and some decorative systems in Ireland reflect Scandinavian culture. Now, the next. This is Dublin, and the excavations have unearthed numerous Viking burial stones in Dublin. And the mixed Irish and Nordic backgrounds, it became a normal thing called Hiberno-Norse, and we have real DNA evidence now that shows that most men with Irish Viking surnames carry mainly Viking genes from Ireland. Okay, let's go back to the regular the other British Isles. This map shows where the Vikings finally settled in the British Isles. The red areas show the Northmen Vikings were already settling in eastern England, parts of Scotland. Parts of western and northern Scotland included the Hebrides, the Orkneys, and the Shetlands. And the yellow area wasn't settled really until the 11th century. But the Vikings settled. They didn't just raid and run. They settled. They colonized, so to speak. And next, Northumberland became the northern kingdom of the Vikings in 867. And York, the town of York, or Yorick, became the headquarters. By 1870, the whole area was called the Danelaw. And the Danes represented about 20 to 25% of the population in that area. So we will be going there soon after we come down from Edinburgh, and we'll be seeing some of the towns. Now, this is King Canute. He's a Danish king of the Danelaw. He is a conqueror who stayed in England instead of staying in Denmark because he wanted to sustain his fleet and soldiers. The empire sort of fell apart after his death. This painting illustrates something that he's famous for. He went out into the sea and thought he could stop the waves. So I think he got embarrassed by that, that's for sure. Anyway, next. The impact of the Viking invasions was to galvanize one area in England, and that's Wessex, the one English kingdom that survived the Vikings, resisted them and prevented them. It was the great army of the Vikings was checked by King Alfred. This is a picture of him. And he imposed a treaty on the Vikings. He was able to create a kingdom in response to those Viking attacks, and that's actually the beginning of the foundation of England, because this kingdom really became England once the Danes had to leave Danelaw. His successors brought Danish regions back under English control. So, as mentioned, the Vikings' raids and settlements extended to the far north Scottish lands and the islands of Orkney, where we've been today, and Shetlands. So let's focus on those for a second, and let's focus on Orkney, since we just all came from it today. This is a group of more 70 islands and inlets, only about 20 of which are inhabited, and it lies just 20 miles north of the Scottish mainland. And going back even further, this I thought we saw on our tour today of the land. Well before the Vikings arrived in the northern islands of Scotland, there was much evidence of prehistoric or Neolithic occupation at various periods, the underground houses and the rest. Scarborough is that village on the west coast, and we've seen a lot of relics from the Neolithic period in those underground homes. And in 1999, the whole site was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And many of us saw those prehistoric ruins today and on the excursions. So here we go. After the prehistoric ones, there was another group of inhabitants called the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, in Scotland. They were an Iron Age people who'd lived in the north and eastern parts of what is now Scotland from approximately the 4th century to the 9th century. And originally, the Picts created two politically and military powerful kingdoms, which dominated a large part of Scotland. And when the Vikings invaded, Lynn, next time. When the Vikings invaded, the Picts resisted Viking attacks, and so we had a constant struggle between the Picts and the Vikings. The Vikings eventually defeated the warring Scottish Picts after 839. They settled in Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, the Isle of Man. They began integrating, if you wish, with the local Gaelic population. And in 875, King Harold Fairhair of Norway ruled the Scottish Isles and the Hebrides, and it's part of Norway, if you wish, at that point. Next. The early religions of the Angles, Jutes, Saxons, and Goths had Scandinavian origins. We want to now quickly get into religion to show you another influence they had, in addition to their political influence on the territory, geography influence. Nordic gods were originally Germanic gods. It's a polytheistic pantheon of gods. And the main ones we hear about, of course, are Odin, who's the supreme god of war. In German, he's called Wotan, and Thor, who's the son of Odin. And as a result, the gods were very significant, and they were Germanic, though, in a sense. The Celtic missionaries for Christianity had already arrived in the 7th century, but the Norsemen and the Vikings were not converted until way, way later. The islands were now being ruled by Norway and Denmark, as was much of the rest of Britain. And the Orkneys and the Shetlands belonged to the King of Norway until 1469. They passed into Scottish rule 1472. And this was the end, finally, the end of Norse, Norway, Denmark, political influence on these islands. And so, but it took a long time, to say the least. There were other influences. We should talk about them. The remains of Norse settlements, and a vast majority of the place names in the Orkneys, etc., have a Norse influence, to say the least. And in addition, this is very interesting, I thought, next. The flag of the Orkneys reflect Viking heritage. This is a flag from 2007. It's a new flag. The colors red and yellow symbolize the Norwegian and Scottish coat of arms. The blue represents the sea and somewhat the blue in the Scottish flag. Interestingly, as you can see, the Orkney flag is way more similar to the flags of Norway and Denmark than it is to Scotland. And so that's a major influence that still retains itself. Anyway, let's focus a bit on Kirkwall, since we were there today, the chief town of the Orkney Islands of Scotland. The involvement of the Norse persisted as late as the 12th century in the Orkneys, and until the red sandstone of St. Marcus Cathedral, which is a dominant factor in the town, was built. But the Norse, the Vikings, really controlled the Orkneys for that period of time. Today, it's part of Scotland, but it does include, some interesting Nordish traditions, built boat building, and the way it processes some of the local agriculture in the rest, and whiskey distilling and all the rest goes into this. The exploitation of the North Sea by the Orkney people, etc., is part of the tradition of the Vikings, to say the least. And there's offshore work being done all the time there. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is language, because that's got a very big impact. The Norse Viking languages have a very big impact on English, to say the least. And so here's a few. We got some of the names of the week. There's actually another chart that is actually a little better than that one. But over 1,000 Norse words are part of standard English. Go to the next slide. These are all Norse words that we've been translated into English. Also, new pronouns, the personal pronouns, the use, he, she, their. These were all Viking type, pronouns. The use of the words to be. So we have a very strong tie to Viking languages, Scandinavian languages. There's also some other examples I could go through. These are not up there. Landing, score, fellow, take, steersman, skirt, sky, skin, again, awkward, birth, cake, fog, law, moss, neck. These are Viking words, Viking Scandinavian words. All the SKs, the SK words, skirt, sky, skin, those all come from, in a sense, Viking languages. And they became, these 1,000 Old Norse words became part of standard English. Words with sounds like, skirt, sky, skin. Even the word window, it means in Scandinavian, window eye. And personal pronouns, they, them, their, replaced the older English forms, to say the least. Next, Lynn. So here's how English evolved, if you wish. As shown on the middle of the chart, Old English evolved from a combination of Old Norse and Danish. And it was later influenced by Norman French, of course, and then a combination of other languages to become modern English. We are a real amalgamation in English, a real amalgamation of other European languages. But the fact that the Vikings played a big role is something that most of us really don't know. I didn't know until I had done some research on it, and it was quite amazing. Because you really, it's pronounced differently in the Norwegian and Danish. It's spelled a little differently, but the words translated are the same, basically. Next, I want to talk about ethnicity. And this is an estimate. Genetic evidence contradicts the perception that the Vikings were primarily or only raiders. They colonized as well. They merged, they intermarried, and they merged into the existing settlements. And so if you're from England, Wales, or Northern Europe, maybe 27% of your genetic being, the genes you have, are from the Vikings. Same thing with Germanic Europe, Eastern Europe and Russia, very similar amounts. And then now it's funny, Sweden's only 14%, Ireland and Scotland 6%, etc. So it's like very interesting because you don't know, but I've always told people if you have English, Irish, Scottish descent, Welsh descent, you probably have some real Viking genes in it, or genetic dispositions there. Now the map of the average ancestry DNA shows you the Scandinavian ethnicity estimates across Great Britain and reveals the pattern. So in the UK areas with the highest Scandinavian ethnicity of 13.5% match up with the former Danelaw regions. That's the darkest red in there. In the Northeast Midlands, we see the average Scandinavian ethnicity of about 11%. Scotland and Wales range from 8% in Wales to 6.5% in southern Scotland. And in Ireland, the average Scandinavian ethnicity varies. It varies very widely, with a high of 5.3% in Ulster and a low of 2% in Munster. So, you can see that the Danelaw really played a real role, why the English themselves in England proper, have probably way more Scandinavian descent than anywhere else, to say the least. So, Viking influence: genetics, language, place names, some ideology, and of course some religion still in some ways. So to summarize, the Vikings had a tremendous influence on many aspects of the life that is reflected in the British Isles even today. And there's no way around it, to say the least. So with that, a quick summary. The next lecture I'm going to do is The Day at Sea at 10 o'clock, and we're going to talk about the war in the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boats against the Royal Navy, against the U.S. Navy when we entered into the war. And I want to thank you for coming. I'll remain a few minutes back here for questions. And I'll also just remind you that my travel memoir is in the Ship's Boutique. There's a few copies. Otherwise, you could get it on Amazon. If you buy it here and you want me to sign it, I will for you. So I thank you all very, very much.